sustainability. So, agrobiodiversity and ecosystem conservation and management plays a vital role in maintaining the ecological balance, sustainable food production, as well as livelihood. Kerala is endowed with vast or rich biodiversity, where MSSRF and Kerala biodiversity boards being played a milestones or role from decades for the agrobiodiversity conservation as well as the livelihood of the people. On this background, I request Dr. R. Rengalokmi, the Director of Ecotechnology, to chair the session. He has vast experience. He was the Director of Ecotechnology, and he has 5 years of vast experience as a development researcher in the field level, practitioner in the field of sustainability development. So she is working on sustainable livelihood for food system, climate change, ICTs, and development and action. So thank you, ma'am. Please have the chair. As well as agrobiodiversity conservation and livelihood, a Kerala experience. In this session, there are 4 speakers, 3 online, Dr. B. Mohan Kumar, Vice Chancellor, and Dr. C. George Thomas, Dr. Sharada Krishnan, and Dr. Ram Subramanyam. So, and Ram Subramanyam will be in offline. I also request him to sit in the dais. So, as you know, Dr. B. Mohan Kumar, he was the Vice Chancellor of Arunachal University of Studies, Dibrugarh, and he was a professor of agronomy and the vast experience as a professor as well as an educationist. He was also the 5th Dean's Committee member of the ICR on forestry, and he predominantly works in the area of agroforestry, silviculture, sustainability, data analysis, and agrobiodiversity. So, next participant who is also joined on online is Dr. C. George Thomas, is the chairman of the Kerala State Biodiversity Board, Thiruvananthapuram. Dr. George Thomas has his PhD from IRI and was the director of research at Integrated Rural Technology Center, Palakkad, and with the Department of Agronomy. He was also acted as the Associate Dean of College of Horticulture under the Kerala Agriculture University. His work is closely associated with the community development with a special focus on agriculture and allied activities like watershed development and many fields. And our next online participant is Dr. Sharada Krishnan. She is the Executive Director of International Women's Coffee Alliance and Director of Horticulture and Center for Global Initiative, Denver Botanical Garden. She was also the Director of Programs, the Crop Trust. She brings her an extensive background in coffee research and cultivation. She holds a Bachelor's degree in Science in Horticulture as well as a Master from Colorado State University in Horticulture. Her doctoral research at the University of Colorado focused on the conservation genetics of wild coffee in Madagascar. And another person, our Dr. R. Subramanyam, Senior Fellow of Coastal System Research Program, MSSRF. He is a doctorate in Belgium and working in this MSSRF for last 18 years. He has a vast experience on these aspects, and he has participated in national international conferences as well as published 7 books and a lot of publications is under his with including a large 17 chapters, book chapters. So I now request Dr. Rengalokmi to start the session. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. And we'll start the session with the presentation of Dr. Mohan Kumar. He'll be speaking on biodiversity hot spots, the case of tropical home gardens. Because Kerala has been, it's a kind of a practice. The homestead is a kind of an important agrobiodiversity source in which several crops along with the trees has been integrated and has been maintained. So we will hear from Dr. Mohan Kumar about his experience as well as work on homestead and how it can be enhanced in the coming days. Over to you, Dr. Mohan Kumar.
Thank you, Chairman. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon to all the participants, all the moderator, and the fellow speakers, rapporteur. At the outset, let me express my sincere gratitude to the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, the Wayanad Center, for inviting me to make this presentation as part of the Silver Jubilee celebration of the center in Wayanad. Now with that brief opening remark, let me go into my slide. So I hope I can start sharing my screen.
Please go ahead, sir.
Is it visible? Is my screen?
Yeah, it is visible. So
No, sir, not it.
I'm just trying to go to the slide. Okay.
it's
Yeah, now it is visible.
Sports, the case of Kerala Home Gardens. Is it okay? Any problem?
no,
No, this
sir.
is fine, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. As all of you know, the biodiversity crisis is daunting. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the so-called IPBES, in their Global Assessment Report of 2019, stated that the nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. And around 1 million plant and animal species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades. And as all of you know, the biodiversity hotspot concept has been a rallying point and mantra for all kinds of conservation efforts, especially for directing international funding and philanthropy. And the reigning conservation paradigm today is the biodiversity hotspots, especially among the conservationists. And there are, 36 areas around the globe which qualify as hotspots and represent only a mere 2.4% of the total land surface of Earth, but sustain more than 50% of the Earth's endemic plants and 43% of the bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian species. But more than 90% of the biodiversity resources are actually found outside these hotspots, particularly more than 90% of the biodiversity resources are found in the human-dominated tropical landscapes, often dubbed as the biodiversity cold spots or biodiversity cool spots. So these authors, Kaireva and Marweya, in 2003 article, argued that the hotspot concept leaves out vast expanses of the globe with considerable biological diversity in the cold, and therefore they call this areas outside the hotspots, maybe most of those areas outside the hotspots, which support large amount of biological resources or biological diversity as cold spots. And an important example of that, the biodiversity cold spot is probably those multi-strata land use systems called the tropical home gardens, which actually harbinger huge amount of biodiversity, but has received little or no attention from the conservationists. And bringing conservation measures to such landscapes will certainly be a step in the right direction. So talking about Kerala home gardens, this is a picture of the Kerala home garden. The tropical home gardens are intimate, multi-story combinations of various trees and crops, sometimes in association with domestic animals around the homesteads. So they support a huge amount of biological diversity, and they are often considered an important pillar of the food, food system, and of course the subsistence food production system. The tropical home gardens are actually important from the point of view of providing food and nutritional security to large sections of the society, especially in the tropical region. And these tropical home gardens are therefore variously described as time-tested examples of sustainable agroforestry. These are sustainable systems and therefore called the epitome of sustainability. These are also steady-state systems where production equals, roughly balances the respiratory outputs. And because of the huge amount of biological diversity that is often encountered in a relatively small area, often around the homesteads, these are also called an enigma that often eludes the science. So home gardens are there in Kerala, very common, but they are not only present in Kerala, they are present in most parts of the tropical and excuse me, and into the temperate region also. Now, the European Agroforestry Association has classified the agroforestry systems in Europe into 5 types, and kitchen gardens are actually one form of agroforestry that the Europeans do practice. And so also is the Association for Agroforestry. They have included home gardens or home gardening as one of the agroforestry practices. This slide actually shows, that tropical home gardens are present in the Latin American region, African region, the Asian region, especially the South and Southeast Asian region. In that context, Kerala and also Java, these are the 2 meccas of tropical home gardens where considerable amount of research has been done, and also considerable documentation of the species diversity in the homesteads have been made. So this is a picture of on the left-hand side, you see a picture of the Damar agroforestry gardens in Sumatra, Indonesia. On the right, you can see a typical home garden in Sri Lanka. I was just trying to, 1 second. Okay, Sri Lanka. And in the Pacific Islands, Fiji, Samoa, you have home gardens much similar to what you see in Kerala. There's a picture of that. In Africa, the famous Chaga home gardens, and they actually represented traditional bonding with the socio-cultural habits of and the lifestyle of the people. You see the Chaga women dancing within the homesteads, home gardens. So this is a kind of social, home gardens have got an important social dimension too. The home gardens probably represent one of the oldest land use activity in the history of humankind, probably next only to shifting cultivation. And most of these, historically, the home gardens originated from what we now call the dump heap or the incidental route to plant domestication, wherein the hunter-gatherers, after consumption, whatever leftover fruits or tubers were, the leftover roots and tubers were, or discarded around the inhabitations where they germinated and grew, and the sites around the inhabitations probably represented the most conducive site for their growth or germination and growth. And recognition and management of such volunteer plants actually constituted the next step in the road to plant domestication. And it has been reported that the Kerala home gardens may be around 4,000 years old. And the Javanese home gardens, about which I mentioned, the two meccas of home gardens around the world, they are reportedly as old as the 7th millennium BC. In the context of Kerala home gardens, there are some early historical or literary records available. Ibn Battuta, a Persian traveler in the 14th century, he made a description of the home gardens on the Malabar coast. So also natural history studies like Machir, Logan, Nagam, etc. from the Travancore, and also Malabar, Logan from Malabar and others from Travancore region, there were documented evidences or there were descriptions about the home garden systems that was practiced during the 20th century or the 19th century. This slide actually represents the ecosystem services that the home gardens provide. I do not intend to go into the details, but you can see a large number of ecosystem services are provided, all those provisioning services, because food we briefly mentioned about, food provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services. We have seen the case of the Chagga home gardens and provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural services. All these ecosystem services are provided by the homesteads. And talking about food security, I think most of these home gardens are actually represent local food production systems, which provide food, often, nutritious food, nutritious fruits and vegetables, particularly to the household and often to the community too. In Javanese home gardens, it is a common custom there to share the produce on the homesteads to the friends, neighbors, and villagers. And it has been reported that the home garden food supply or home gardens supplement the supply of fresh food at the household level and offers an easy day-to-day access to fresh vegetables and fruits, providing enriched and balanced diets by supplementing proteins, vitamins, and minerals. And experimental evidences from some countries in Southeast Asia has clearly indicated that people with home gardens and control group without home gardens, the children of the former, people with home gardens, were less prone to vitamin B or mineral deficiency diseases such as xerophthalmia and all that. So there are evidences to that. So the home garden produce, the fruits and vegetables, actually supplement proteins, vitamins, and minerals. And these are also considered to be resilient food production systems, which actually reduce food wastage. Because this food wastage is a major issue coming up even in the context of climate change, because the food wastes are actually huge. In India, a huge amount of food wastage is reported, and that is actually a major source of greenhouse gases. So at any cost, it is important to reduce food wastage along the supply chain and strengthen the growth of agricultural capabilities. In that context, home gardens are very important. The rest of my presentation, I will be talking briefly about the main results of our investigations, particularly focusing on the floristic diversity of Kerala home gardens that were, these studies were conducted over the last 2.5 decades. And we evaluated or elucidated the floristic structure, composition, and the extent of similarities and diversities in the composition of the floristic composition of the home gardens, with particular reference to small, medium, and large holding size categories. And the results of these studies are provided in detail on the books that are shown, the cover pages of which are shown on the right-hand side of the slide. So we also investigated how species diversity influences carbon sequestration potential. And in that context, examine the relationship between floristic diversity and carbon stocks for the home gardens of Central Kerala, and also examine the relationship between plant diversity and soil carbon sequestration, which, as you know, is an important means for increasing soil carbon stocks or even above ground vegetation carbon stocks. These are important methods or means for mitigating climate change. And another study, we examined the floristic diversity of the home gardens along an altitudinal gradient in Central Kerala from the coast to highlands. We sampled the home gardens up to about 1,800 meters. And the changes in the home garden structure and diversity in view of urbanization, we conducted a study in Calicut city to assess the impact of, increasing rates of urbanization on the structure and the floristic diversity home gardens. And also, recently we conducted a study, we evaluated the contribution of home gardens in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is actually very important when the COVID-19 pandemic has hindered the achievement of many crucial SDGs. There's a shortfall. Okay, the first study actually shows home garden actually represent a key locus of biodiversity conservation. Small, medium, and large size samples holdings exhibited profound variability in the number of woody taxa. Around 127 species, woody species were recorded. Mean Simpson's diversity index for the homesteads range from 0.25 to 0.79, and floristic diversity home gardens was moderate to low compared to the value of 0.9 for the species-rich wet evergreen forest of the Western Ghats. There was a great diversity of not only tree species, but also herbs, shrubs, vines, trees, and also other perennials with several functional groups. Many landraces and cultivars and rare and endangered species are frequently encountered in the home gardens. So there is a parallel study that was conducted in Bangladesh. Webb and Kabir recognized as many as 419 species, of which 6 were reported to be on the IUCN red list of Bangladesh. The species richness and tree density were highest for small holdings, as you can see in the graph on the right-hand side. The total species and the species per hectare, as you can see, the species per hectare decreased as the home garden size increased. However, the total number of species showed a more, I would say, differential pattern. So Simpson's diversity index were 0.64, 0.4, 0.46 for the subset of small, medium, and large home gardens, implying that small gardens are particularly important in maintaining species diversity. And large-sized home gardens, however, had more stems per garden. Average above-ground carbon stocks were in the range of 16 to 36 megagrams per hectare. Although the large home gardens had higher total carbon stocks on per garden basis, the small gardens exhibited higher stocks on a unit area basis. Holding size and management factors are important. Therefore, in our study of home garden diversity along an altitudinal gradient, as you can see from the picture, did not show any concrete pattern, and you can see the scatter all around. So high altitude locations such as Watavada, where winter vegetable growing is predominant, had very small number of species, and of course Pallivasal and Madakatara, which are in different altitudinal zones, had the highest number of species. So there was no clear pattern. And soil carbon sequestration, we looked at home gardens with higher number of plant species as well as higher species richness and tree density had higher soil carbon. Soil carbon stocks are extremely important. That is 3 times the size of the vegetation carbon stocks. Overall, within the 1 meter profile, soil carbon content ranged from 1.101 to 127 megagram per hectare. And small sized home gardens that had higher tree density and plant species diversity had more soil carbon per hectare, as you can see from the slide. I'm not going to the details because of the paucity of time. So overall, home gardens are very important for agro-biodiversity conservation. It enhances, habitat diversity, it enhances species diversity, it enhances genetic diversity because many land races of croplands and genetically diverse tree populations present. Soil diversity also is in many kinds of soil organisms are present. And however, landscape simplification process is happening. And there may be complementary resource use and facilitative production happening in the home garden, which may favor the biodiversity, home garden agro-biodiversity conservation. So overall, bottom line is that home gardens are examples of circumsystem reservoirs of biodiversity. The circumsystem reservoirs of biodiversity means preservation of planted and or relic trees and wildlings on the farmland where natural forest or woodland containing the same trees existed once before, but this has been lost or altered significantly through agricultural expansion. And conservation in future will need to rely increasingly on a smallholder circumsystem approach. However, long-term effectiveness of this strategy may be questionable because transition to lower and less valuable species composition on the farmland may happen over time because the early cereal versus the late cereal successional status of the species. My last main point is with respect to the home gardens and the SDGs. Home gardens probably represent a very important strategy for attaining the SDGs, and they have this ability to provide food security, nutritional needs. And in our recent study, we classified the SDGs, 17 SDGs into 5 categories. As you can see, I'm not going into the details, and most of these SDGs can be provided. The home gardens are capable of providing or supporting most of these SDGs, like climate change or food, zero hunger. I don't want to improve. Okay, I'm just going. Okay, but the point is, the question is, are home gardens becoming extinct because of the advent of market economy? There may be consequent, because of the market economy, there may be emphasis on maximization of production and use of external inputs in crop production, which may not augur well for the biodiversity conservation. And this has happened in Assam, where tea gardens are, the home gardens are being converted into tea gardens. Commercialization has happened in Indonesia, where the pekarangens and the carbon systems have been simplified or commercialized, and result was lower species diversity. In Ethiopia, transition from traditional inset plus coffee system has happened. A large proportion of the Kerala home gardens also have been converted into small marginal, into coconut and rubber plantations. And there has been also, this has not only been happening in the rural areas, but in the urban regions also. This is happening in the city of Kozhikode. We did a study, and because of spatial densification, that is adding more people to the same area, and house construction, etc., which competes more directly for the land for gardening, there was an overall decline of 11.5% in the cultivated plant species in the home gardens. That reflects loss of urban biodiversity. Talking about the rural home gardens, the evolutionary trends shows that in Nanniyoda, in Trivandrum and Pududana Panchayats of Kerala, in Wayanad, shows that many of the traditional tree species that are present in the homes.
So can you please conclude?
Yes, I'm just done. My last slide. So home gardens represent integrated small holder production systems. They maintain biodiversity in the managed ecosystems and provide a range of food products, play a vital role in promoting food and nutrition security, but commercialization has been happening. There is a need for revitalization of the home garden traditional land use systems, but what kind of programs or policies are in place for conserving these biodiversity hotspots? The government of, Sri Lanka may not be a good example to mention at this point in time, but the government of Sri Lanka has incorporated home gardening as a key element to the support food and nutrition security in their INDs, in their UN Red Plus program. We also, in Kerala also, we probably need to evolve some scheme under the payment for ecosystem services to support the farmers or the home gardeners. And on that note, let me conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for an interesting presentation, and you have captured the different dimensions of home gardens and how it has been functioning and what are the challenges right now we have been facing and how it is related to policies also. So, Foundation has been working on home gardens and how to strengthen the home gardens, especially in the context of declining dietary diversity and increasing malnutrition among the population in Kerala. Maybe during the discussion session, some of the experiences of MSSRF will also be come up and we can see how we can carry forward the discussion forward. Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Yeah, now we will move to the second presenter, Dr. George Thomas. So over to you, sir. 20 minutes presentation.
Okay. So, good afternoon, all participants, both online and offline. Well, I was supposed to attend the program offline because of so many programs. I could not do that, but I am joining online. And I am very happy to be a part of this Silver Jubilee celebrations of MSSRF. All the best for the program and the institute. Let me start my talk on agrobiodiversity, conservation of agrobiodiversity and its sustainable issues. So I'll start my program by sharing the screen. I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay, so all of us know the definition of biodiversity, and when we talk about biodiversity, we usually include the species diversity, the genetic diversity, and the ecosystem diversity. So when we talk about agrobiodiversity or agricultural biodiversity, there again, we talk about the species diversity, the diversity within the species, and of course, the ecosystem, probably that may be the farming systems. And here we consider the organisms, the plants, animals, microorganisms that are used directly or indirectly for food and agriculture. That means the crops, livestock, forestry, and fisheries. So in a broader sense, we had to consider all these organisms. And as we know, it happened some 10,000 years ago when our forefathers started domestication of crops. So it is because of the careful selection and inventive development of farmers, then those who maintain livestock and fisherfolk over millennia. Well, when we simply say agrobiodiversity, that includes harvested crop varieties, livestock, fishes, and non-domesticated resources within the field, ranges, forest, and so on. Then along with that, non-harvested species in production ecosystem, that is also a part of that. Soil microbes, pollinators, and other insects. Then non-harvested species in the wider environment, that includes the environmental plants. And that support food production ecosystems, wild relatives, and this kind of the organisms or plants which help in erosion control and so on. And it is also concerned with the diversity of ecosystem. Well, there is another terminology mainly used by CGIAR, that is biodiversity for food and agriculture. There, instead of agrobiodiversity, they use the term plant genetic resources. That means the between and within species plant diversity. So that includes commercial cultivars, genetic stocks, breeding lines, wild progenitors, and land races. So we know that land races include farmer varieties, local varieties, or primitive varieties of crops. So these are also part of biodiversity. Then probably all of you may be knowing the distinctive features of agrobiodiversity when compared with the mainstream biodiversity. Agrobiodiversity is, of course, you may see only in farmers' field, and it is managed by male and female farmers, both are involved. And diversity within crop species, probably that may be more important than diversity between crop species. And many components of agrobiodiversity will not survive without human interference. And along with that, local knowledge and culture are integral parts of agrobiodiversity management. And its conservation is linked to sustainable use of bioresources. Well, another important feature is, many economically important farming systems, they are based on introduced crops. So if we take an example of Kerala, most of our crops, rubber, for example, rubber, we can say about 1/4 net cultivated area of Kerala is occupied by rubber. Then cassava, cashew, coffee, pineapple. So these are all introduced crops, and these are very much important as far as the economy of Kerala is concerned. Indigenous plants, their wild and weed relatives, and well-adapted crop introductions are also part of agrobiodiversity. And when we consider the biodiversity conservation, we usually talk about in situ and ex situ. As far as agrobiodiversity is concerned, probably in situ conservation is less relevant than ex situ conservation. Of course, now we are giving more stress on in situ conservation also, especially through custodian farmers. Then in general, ex situ conservation through gene banks or freedom materials are more popular than on-farm conservation. See, when we consider the components of agricultural biodiversity, let us start with the crop diversity. So I'll start from global and come to Kerala. So we know that around 250,000 plant species have been identified. Not, see, if you take the total biodiversity as a whole, it may come to about 8.7 billion, not billion, million. But only 250,000 plant species have been identified. And out of these, 30,000 plants have some edible uses. And about 7,000 plant species have been domesticated. And in that 7,000, only about 150 species are widely cultivated. But still, only 30 crops that almost feed the world and which provide 95% of dietary energy. And still, if you narrow, just 10 crops provide 75% of the world's staple food, and that includes our rice, wheat, maize, potato, cassava, soybean, sweet potato, sorghum, yams, and banana. And still, we can narrow 3 mega crops, rice, wheat, and maize. They make up about 60% of total food requirement of the world, and that provides staples for over 400 crores of people, 4 million people. Then it also includes, along with the crop biodiversity, higher animals, wild plant biodiversity, below ground plant biodiversity, that is mainly concerned with the plant roots, then microbial biodiversity, anthropod biodiversity, other macroorganisms, that includes the earthworms, then agrobiodiversity at ecosystem level. So agrobiodiversity in a broader sense that start from crop biodiversity to agrobiodiversity at ecosystem level, and all these kind of things, microbial biodiversity, anthropod biodiversity, because although we always fear the pests, insects, and many of them are helping the farmers, being pollinators, predators, and those involved in the soil cycle and so on. Well, most of you are familiar with GI, geographical indication, and biodiversity. So that is also a way of preserving biodiversity. Okay, so that will protect, and most of the land races or varieties declared as GI, they are in a sense a particular variety or ecosystem. They are it is a helpful practice to maintain or to preserve that a particular kind of land races or cultivars. So for example, in Kerala, these are some of the agricultural products from Kerala declared as GI. So I have listed the latest Kuttiyatur mango. Edayor chili and Kuttiyatur mango, they are the latest addition. It starts from Nyavara rice. So I'm not going to read all these kind of things. So anyway, all these kind of things are linked to certain geographical regions. And because of that geographical regions, these got prominence, and it is very easy to preserve these. And these are mainly related to a particular land race or a particular type. For example, Chengalikodan, Nendran banana. So that Chengalikodan grows well near Guruvayur and Trichur area. Kuttiyatur is of course from Kuttiyatur, and Tirur betel leaf, that is from Tirur. So GI is an important part of biodiversity conservation, we can say that. Then coming to plant and crop diversity in India. See, again, I'm not going to read all this kind of thing. According to the latest estimate from Botanical Survey of India, there are about 54,000 plants. So in fact, they have recorded 54,733 plants. And that represents approximately 14% of the total recorded plant species. Then out of that, some 5,000 species are useful. So initially I told some 7,000 plants have been domesticated. So here the information is that 5,000 species are useful. But out of that, 480 cultivated plant species have been recorded. And Kerala, again, 5,094 flowering plants. But when you come to the crop diversity, see, a recent study which we conducted from Kerala State Biodiversity Board, we were able to record 452 crops. So these are the crops classified based on their primary use. And out of this, edible species are 256. So total is 452, and all of them are not equally important. See, you can see our gross cultivated area is just 25.86 lakh hectares, and crops occupying more than 10,000 hectares is just 17 number, 17. And out of that, crops having area above 1 lakh hectares is just 4. That is coconut, rubber, rice, and banana. So banana including plantain, because in most cases, it's very difficult to separate banana and plantain. Okay, so the area, the crops are ranked according to their area occupied, starting from coconut to cocoa. 17th rank is with the cocoa. Well, all of us talk about the loss of biodiversity, we blame climate change and so on. And if you consider agricultural biodiversity, as you know, after 1900, about 75% of crop genetic diversity has been lost. Because that is quite natural also. Farmers all over the world, they prefer varieties which give them more yield and more economic returns. And as far as livestock is concerned, about 30% of are at the risk of extinction. But fortunately, efforts are now going on to preserve the genetic diversity, especially through ex situ conservation. Well, there are at least 4 ways for conservation of agrobiodiversity. In situ conservation, and especially in situ conservation, especially through on-farm conservation and through traditional ecosystems and through custodian farmers. Then ex situ conservation, of course, through institutional mechanisms. They employ some banks, seed banks, and so on. Then promotion and conservation of agrobiodiversity through sustainable use. So if you are able to adopt technique for development of propagation, cultivation, pest and disease control in tune with nature, probably you may be able to conserve some of these systems. And we can also promote farmer level breeding techniques And such kind of things comes under that particular aspect. Then ecosystem level conservation, the declaration of agricultural heritage sites, etc., comes under that fourth category. See, some of the measures which can be promoted to conserve agricultural biodiversity, say in situ. So farmers will not go on preserving biodiversity if there are no incentives, because in most cases, the local varieties, land races, etc., are low yielding. So incentives and other measures to promote the cultivation of local varieties are minor crops are needed. So you have to identify custodian farmers, you have to institute some awards, and you have to give them some incentives being a custodian farmer, and for keeping a multitude of crops in their or varieties in their farm. That sort of incentive is needed. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to coax farmers to keep varieties in their homestead. Then promoting the use of integrated approaches, which reduces the use of agrochemicals or upset pest predator dynamics. You can think of integrated crop management, integrated nutrient management, integrated pest management, and so on. Then you can promote technologies and techniques to enable communities to protect local agricultural biodiversity, such as community seed banks. Well, I already mentioned about a custodian farmer. Who is a custodian farmer? So this is a definition given by Stapit and others. So they are those who maintain a diverse portfolio of traditional crop species and varieties, who select species and varieties adapted to local conditions, and who promote the use and conservation of local diversity among their friends and neighbors. So they are experts in in-situ conservation, and they're extremely useful as research partners, and they also maintain a large number of crops, varieties, and so on. So these are gene banks. So I did not elaborate on these kind of things. So all of us are well aware about gene banks. You can have a plant seed bank, animal seed bank, field gene bank, in vitro gene bank. Well, along with that, international facilities are also available. Biodiversity International, they are doing extremely well, and they have 7.4 million accessions are currently maintained globally. And they themselves, through their CGIAR centers, around 7,68,000 accessions of 35 crops. Then this is a global seed vault, Svalbard Global Seed Vault, that is in Norway. So there, they almost maintain duplicates of samples, seed samples maintained by Biodiversity International. Well, these are some of the facilities we established in India. NBPGR for plants, NBAGR for animal genetic resources, NBAIM for microorganisms, NBAIR for agriculturally important insect resources, and NFFPGR NECNO for fish genetic resources. And we have an Indian seed vault. So this is established in Ladakh region. It's a high altitude research, and it has been established with the help of Defense Institute of High Altitude Research and the National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources. So similar to the global seed vault, they also do maintain duplicates of seed samples. Then the last category, ecosystem level conservation. Here what they do is we maintain some of the ecosystems, some of the agricultural practices or farming system we want to preserve somehow. So a first step was declaration of globally important agricultural heritage systems by FAO. So some institutional mechanisms are there, must be there to coordinate initiative to achieve production, conservation, and livelihood objectives. So, and some criteria are already available for identifying agrobiodiversity rich areas, especially land race diversity, presence of wild relatives, agro-ecosystem diversity. And some rationale we can put forth. See, most of these agricultural heritage systems, they may have sustained the local population with the continuous supply of food and other livelihood requirement. Natural evolution and selection are still continuing in this area. The sites can provide diverse genes and gene sources for adaptive research. The complex ecosystems of such sites provide unique opportunities for speciation and diversity through the development of new land races, animal breeds. See,
Sir, excuse me, sir, 2 more minutes. Can you please wind up?
Okay. Yeah. See, these are 3 globally important agricultural heritage system, and out of this, Kuttanad below sea level farming is in Kerala. See, some criteria has also been put forth for identifying agricultural heritage systems, and these are some of the potential agricultural heritage systems in Kerala. So that includes Kol, Pokali, Kaipod, Panchakrishi, homestead farming system, which Professor Mohan Kumar was discussing, Kundal Padangal, Kayyala, Surangam, Keni, drainage using Petti and Para. Okay, then say quality seed production must also be a part of the preservation of conservation of biodiversity. Then you can have seed festivals and fairs where you can exchange seeds with fellow farmers and excellent opportunity. Then farmer to farmer seed exchange mechanisms are there. Seed banks, several kinds of seed banks are available. See, de facto seed banks, ceremonial seed banks, community seed exchange, organized seed banks, seed savers network. Of course, de facto seed banks and organized seed banks, probably they may be the most popular. Then something about sustainability of agricultural systems. I'm going to wind up, don't worry, within 1 or 2 minutes I'll complete. Okay, so using agricultural practices based on biodiversity, that's number 1. Soil erosion can be reduced by employing agricultural biodiversity practices. Then pests and diseases can be controlled if you select plants and continue with the local agricultural practices. Then in greater diversity in landscape. Then wild biodiversity conservation, that is also a part of wild biodiversity. You have to, and soil quality. Soil quality is another one. You have to increase organic carbon content. And if you go for better crop rotations, it displayed increased soil carbon by 28 to 112% and nitrogen by 18 to 58% compared with those with the low agricultural biodiversity. And yield also increases if you go for diversifying corn and soybean systems. Then increases resilient to environmental fluctuation, especially climate change and so on. Okay, so I wind up my discussion now. So agricultural biodiversity, when you talk about agricultural biodiversity, that includes not only the plant biodiversity, it's crop biodiversity, the insects are involved, animals are involved, then ecosystems are involved, farming systems are involved, sustainable uses are also involved. And along with that, conservation must be, of course, ex-situ conservation is very important. Along with that, we should also embark upon and we should ask our farmers to go for in-situ conservation, especially where these systems are prevalent. That is more easy instead of asking an industrialized a person who is following modern agricultural practices. It is very easy to ask a farmer who are in the traditional agricultural practice.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much, sir. Thank you for highlighting the different levels, structure, as well as systems of conservation, especially related to Kerala context, how different ecosystem services can be recognized and can be promoted to have a wider diversity. And also the crop diversity itself, you have highlighted the different crops have been cultivated, and including other diversity related to wild and soil biodiversity conservation. Thank you very much, sir, for a comprehensive presentation on specific focus to Kerala and agrobiodiversity conservation. Please stay with us for the questions. Two more presenters are there in this session, sir. Thank you. So now,
Thank you.
the third presenter of this session, Dr. Sharatha Krishnan. She is from International Women's Coffee and also representing Crop Trust. Okay. So it may take some time. Now we will move to the fourth presenter, Dr. Subramanyam. He will be presenting on mangrove restoration MSSRF experience in different parts of India. Over to you, Subramanyam.
Good afternoon. First of all, I will like to thank the organizers for providing this opportunity to speak in front of you. And MS Swaminathan Research Foundation initiated mangrove restoration somewhere in early 1990. We started our program in Pichavaram, and it has been upscaled in other states also. So how Professor Swaminathan has identified the mangroves are very important as they provide saline tolerant genes, which are very vital in the context of climate change because of sea level rise. Larger areas of our agricultural fields along the coastal area will be getting salinized, and the saline tolerant genes from the mangroves will play an important role in getting saline tolerant crops. We have started our work, and then simultaneously we also observed the mangrove resources along our coast, particularly the Asian countries have been degraded, and we want to conserve those mangrove resources because these mangrove ecosystems provide enormous amount of ecosystem services. There are about more than 70 ecosystem services which the coastal community are depending on the mangroves for their livelihood. So these are small artisanal fishermen living very close to the mangroves, depend on the mangroves for their livelihood because mangroves are one of the important habitat for the juvenile as well as the fishery resources which depend on the mangroves for their feeding ground. So this is a study made by Mr. Debroy and Jaraman in Pichavaram. Actually, Pichavaram mangroves, the fishery potential of the Pichavaram mangroves is about 1.65 crores. The ecotourism and other potential contributes nearly 15 crores. Overall, if you see the other ecosystem services, both direct as well as indirect, it comes nearly about 336 crores. Per year. So this is about the value of Sundarban mangroves. It is about around 6,64,140 million Indian rupees. So lot of ecosystem services, including the blue carbon, then attenuation of wave energy and other coastal erosion control are the major contributors. So mangroves are potential carbon sequester ecosystem because if you see the mangrove ecosystem, the root as well as the soil will be having a lot of biomass. they actually sequester a large amount of carbon and keep them below the ground. These carbon are because the area is underwater and it is under anoxic condition. Whatever the carbon stored in the ground will not be coming out due to oxidation. So oxygen levels will be very low. If the mangroves are degraded, then whatever the stored carbon inside the ground will be slowly coming out. So conservation of mangroves in the context of climate change and the blue carbon, it is very important to conserve these mangroves. If you compare the mangroves versus other terrestrial forests, the mangroves sequesters more than 10 times of below ground carbon than other terrestrial plants. So as I already explained, whatever the carbon stored below the ground, it needs to be protected. For that only a lot of efforts are being taken by all over the country to conserve these mangrove resources because they are very good carbon sequester capacity they have. So if you see the mangroves, it will store nearly about 50 metric tons to 220 metric tons per acre during their growing period. And globally, if you see around 18 million hectares of mangroves we have, so it actually has about 24 million metric tons of carbon. So if the mangroves are degraded for man-made as well as anthropogenic causes, whatever the carbon stored will be emitted, and it is expected that 678 teragrams of carbon will be come out from the stored ground by 2095. So impact of sea level on mangroves also is great concern because sea levels are rising nearly about 3 millimeters per year, but it differs from region to region, but on an average it is increasing by 3 millimeters. Because of that, some of the mangroves will slowly migrate towards the area which is now occupied by halophytes and salt marshes. So if those areas are not available, then mangroves will undergo inundation and the extent will be lost due to sea level rise. So this is about the carbon emissions from the global mangroves due to loss. So the areas in the Asian countries will be losing more carbon. Asian as well as the African, the South American region will be losing more carbon due to a lot of land use changes, particularly in Asian countries. Because of aquaculture, large areas of mangroves are being converted for aquaculture and other purposes, and whatever the destruction had happened, whatever the carbon stored below the ground will be slowly coming out, and it will contribute to the increase in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. If you see in Australia region, the climate change will contribute more for the release of carbon dioxide. So mangroves also have some of the endangered plants. Totally about 11 endangered plants are there, in which India we have around 2 species. One is Heritiera formis, that is the candidate species in Sundarbans, that is in locally it's called Sundari. Based on that plant, the Sundarban mangroves was coined the term Sundarbans. Then Sonaresia griffithii, these are all are affected due to the freshwater flow. Because of damming, a large amount of freshwater is being tapped and very less freshwater is coming to the mangroves. And also a lot of geomorphological changes like change of river course towards the downstream. So that also affects the availability of fresh water, as well as the climatic conditions like increase in temperature, then tidal amplitude, variation in tidal amplitude. Because of these reasons, some of the mangroves are already extinct, particularly in Picharam, where about 13 species were there earlier, but now 2-3 Soneraceae apetala, then Xylocarpus were all almost extinct. Similarly, mangrove also support the fauna, particularly some endangered species like saltwater crocodiles, then Royal Bengal tiger, then otters, then fishing cat. These are all critically endangered species. If a mangrove area is lost, definitely these habitats also will be lost, and for these animals it will be extinct. Like the mangroves are the first line defense for the disasters like cyclone, and if you see this table, the world we have witnessed around 13 tropical cyclones, of which if you see around 9 cyclones are all in Bay of Bengal, which has taken over large lives as well as the property. But recent years, due to better forecasting systems, the human loss is being reduced to a great extent, but the property loss is very high. So mangroves actually plays a major important role in reducing the wave during these cyclones. So about 100 meters of wide mangroves, dense mangroves can reduce nearly 50% of the tidal storm surge. So mangroves actually reduces wind speed as well as the salt spray. Because of that, the agriculture productivity will not be getting much affected. So Emma Swaminathan Research Foundation, we have started our mangrove restoration work in early 1990 because till then mangroves were felled for fuel wood needs. The government itself have done co-felling on a 25 years rotation basis. Because of that, large mangrove areas which were about to coppice on their own, some of the species are not good coppices. Because of that, the mangrove areas were, large areas were degraded, and the domestic needs like fuel wood, fodder, then timber for house construction, the dependency was very high, and that is also one of the major cause. Apart from that, if you see in the Asian countries, aquaculture is a major culprit, and even in Andhra Pradesh, more than 8,000 hectares of good mangroves were converted for agriculture, but aquaculture, but they were all located just very close to the reserve forest boundary that belonged to the private entrepreneur. Then changes in topography due to river water discharge, because sediments being brought and deposited along the river course, which has actually hampered the tidal flow of water. So that is also one of the reasons wherever tidal water is not going, that area will become a degraded one. So cyclones actually, during 1977, we had a Divyasama cyclone in Krishna, wherein more than 10,000 people were killed, and the tidal wave actually came more than 32 feet near the coast, and it has marooned almost half of the district. More than 10 feet water was seen in almost about 10 kilometers away from the coast. Then climate change also, as I already told, it will also have huge impact on mangroves, and should dieback disease is one of the cause actually, because of increase in evapotranspiration as well as increase in temperature. Some of the mangroves in Australia have been affected and it has been lost. So these are the degraded area. We started our work in early 1996 in Andhra Pradesh. During that time, we had nearly more than 25% of the area of that forest has been degraded, and these are the aquaculture areas where previously mangroves were there in 1997. It has been converted for aquaculture, and these are the losses due to aquaculture. This is in Krishna. In even Krishna Delta also, large areas of mangroves were converted for agriculture. So we actually, as in MSSRF, we used to work most closely with the community. We are a community-centric and process-oriented approach. We have restored nearly 2,000 hectares of degraded mangroves in west as well as east coast. West coast we have done in Navi Mumbai in about 25 hectares. So we actually mobilized the community and formed village-level institutions where the men and women will be having equal representation. And we formed a village-level mangrove management unit, which will be having degraded area for management, that is to restore and conserve. Then we prepare a joint micro plan and implement the mangrove restoration activities. So mangroves, if you see in general, mangroves need a tidal water flow. During high tide, water has to go inside the area and it has to recede during low tides. But in few cases, because of changes in the topography, the high tide water is not going. Because of that, the area becomes hypersaline, and the soil salinity, if you see, it is very high. Even some of the halophytes, which can able to grow more than 100 ppt of pore water, those plants are also not coming because of elevated soil salinity. So we actually dug shallow canals. If you see the tidal cycle, every 6 hours we will be having on high tide, and next 6 hours we will be having low tide. So the tidal water goes inside the degraded areas and reduces the soil salinity. And because of reduction in soil salinity, because mangroves need soil salinity of about 20 to 30 parts per thousand of water. Some of the plants like Avicennia marina, which can withstand up to 90 parts per thousand. So these
3 minutes.
Okay. So these canals actually facilitated tidal water flow into the degraded area, and slowly the mangrove are planted and it has come well. So these are some of the activities we have carried out. This is the mangrove area we have restored in Krishna district. These are the images. It has been completely covered. This one we have started in 2017 in Krishna in about 200 hectares of mangroves. And it has come very well. There is a small video clip for about 20 seconds. This has been funded by Adaptation Fund Board through NABARD, and it is 200 hectares of mangroves. We have planted Rhizophora as well as Avicennia marina. And a lot of the Yanadi community started fishing in these mangroves because this is a very good habitat for the mud crabs. These are the areas we have worked in. Tamil Nadu we have covered around 900 hectares, and Andhra Pradesh also 900. And in Orissa we have done 240 hectares, and in West Coast, Thane River, we have done 25 hectares of mangroves. These are the land use changes between 2000 and 2020. Large areas of degraded areas were completely covered by both us as well as the Forest Department. These are the areas of Krishna land use changes. This is about the Pichavaram. Before our intervention, there were about 400 hectares of mangroves. Now it has almost doubled. So every 2 years, the Forest Survey of India is doing an assessment on mangrove cover. So the red portions, actually Andhra Pradesh, because of aquaculture, the mangrove area of about 495 hectares in 1987 has been reduced, and now it is slowly coming up. It has reached around 404 hectares, square kilometers, sorry. And in Andamans, because of tsunami, large areas of mangroves were destructed, and now it is slowly coming back, but the loss was very much high. So integrated mangrove fishery farming system is one of the climate change adaptation strategy we are doing in Andhra Pradesh as well as in Tamil Nadu. It is a farming system wherein mangroves and aquaculture are integrated, and we have done crab culture as well as fattening in these ponds, and sea bass is also being cultured. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Subramanyam, for sharing the joint mangrove management system as a kind of a case, and through which how foundation took an effort to restore more than 2,000 hectares of degraded mangrove ecosystem, as well as highlighting other opportunities where through integrated mangrove farming system, how these practices can be made into a kind of a domesticated one. Yeah, maybe we will, during the discussion, we will discuss how this context can be applied to Kerala coast, and how messes of activities can be integrated into it. Thank you. So now we are moving to the last presentation. Now I invite Dr. Sharada Krishnan, who is the head director of International Women's Coffee, as well as director for the Crop Trust organization. Dr. Sharada, we had 3 presentations on this session. One is about the homestead garden, and second one is about agrobiodiversity conservation, and third one now you heard the mangrove restoration practices. So we will complete your presentation, then we will have a discussion among all the 4 presentations. Now over to you, Sharada.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to be part of this consultation. And I am going to be talking about, let me get here, about challenges to conservation in the context of climate change. Okay, here we go. So I am, I know you have speakers who are talking specifically from the Kerala experience, but I am going to talk more in general terms in a broader context. And so specifically from the biodiversity conservation, I'm going to be specifically concentrating on agrobiodiversity. And what is, I know you have been talking about agrobiodiversity, but what is agrobiodiversity? It is, if you look at the FAO definition, it's the variety and variability of animals, plants, and microorganisms, as well as the diversity of the genetic resources and species, diversity of species, and diversity of non-harvested species that support production, such as pollinators or other microorganisms, as well as pests or diseases, and also the diversity of agro-ecosystems. And it also includes the cultural and local knowledge of that diversity, traditional knowledge. And climate change affects multiple sectors in virtually every part of the world. And it impacts impacts on one sector may influence other sectors, and hence these risks are all interconnected. So you can see with an increase in plant disease or increase in forest decline, you're going to have a decline in crop production. So all of these are interconnected. And so this visualization highlights the need to address the impact and vulnerability of climate risk interconnectedness. So this risk map also shows how changes in climate impact natural and socio-economic systems, ultimately affecting human society, security, health, and well-being. So food security vulnerabilities to climate change encompass the environmental, economic, and social dimensions. So climate change threatens to reverse the process made so far in the fight against hunger and malnutrition. So as per the assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change augments and intensifies risks to food security for the most vulnerable countries and populations. 4 out of 8 key risks induced by climate change identified by the IPCC-AR5 have direct consequences to food security. And these include loss of rural livelihoods and income, loss of marine and coastal ecosystems and livelihoods, and we just heard about the restoration of mangroves, which is very important, and loss of terrestrial and inland water ecosystems and livelihoods, as well as food insecurity and breakdown of food systems. So the earliest and the more impacted are the most vulnerable countries and populations, including the arid and semi-arid areas in landlocked countries and small island developing states. So you can see from this map, this is the current map of food security and climate change. And you can see from the lighter to the darker you go, it goes from, the vulnerability goes from low to high. And you can see India is kind of in the middle of the of this vulnerability scale. So climate change will also have broader impacts through effects on trade flows, food markets, and price stability, and could introduce new risks for human health, as we have seen with the pandemic. Greatly expanded efforts to respond to climate change are needed immediately to safeguard the capacity of food systems to ensure global food security. Climate change has both direct and indirect impacts on agricultural production systems. Direct impacts include effects caused by a modification of physical characteristics such as temperature levels and rainfall distribution on specific agricultural production systems. Indirect effects are those that affect production through changes on other species such as pollinators, pests, disease vectors, and invasive species. These indirect effects can play a major role. They're much more difficult to assess and project given the high number of interacting parameters and links, many of which are still unknown. So the majority of the world's poor and food insecure people are rural, with direct and indirect dependence on agricultural production and income for their livelihoods, and are thus directly exposed to any risk that would impact agricultural production. And you can see this through this interactive map with the change in food security due to climate change over time. So I was able to do 2 different scenarios where in the 2050s, when you select high emissions with no adaptation, you can see how the map changes. The food insecurity gets higher in many countries, and then it gets worse with high emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as no adaptations. By 2080s, you can see where India, from the medium vulnerability, it goes to very high vulnerability. And so looking at those key vulnerabilities to food security, if we're looking at the environmental dimension, there is going to be high level of sea level rise and coastal flooding, including storm surge, and which is going to affect many low-lying coastal areas and small island developing states. And then in mountainous areas, you're going to see higher landslide erosion, water cycle disturbances, and shift to ecosystem. And coral reefs are going to be affected along with the ecosystem services for coastal communities. And also those facing water scarcity, the supplies are going to become irregular. And especially farmers in drylands or pastoralists are going to have insufficient access to drinking and irrigation water. And this will also lead to diminution of genetic pools. And then we are going to be exposed to novel hazards, and because of these new hazards, which we have never experienced before, we don't know how to deal with these hazards. and also leading to monoculture-based systems. And then the economic dimension, the vulnerabilities will be, a lot of the populations will have limited ability to compensate for these losses in rain-fed systems and pastoral systems. And then also will lead to increased conflicts in areas because of the limited natural resources. And also the increase in undernourishment and malnourishment, and the populations in urban and rural settings. There's going to be increased impoverishment, and especially farmers who are net food buyers and people in low-income agriculturally dependent economies. And then the social dimension is going to we're going to see multidimensional poverty and limited alternative livelihoods. And because they are mostly dependent on agriculture, many of these areas are not going to be conducive for agriculture. So limited ability to cope and adapt due to marginalization. And also there is going to be gender-based differences in coping mechanisms, and also a food security crisis. So the key way to reduce the impacts of climate change on food security and nutrition is to reduce these underlying vulnerabilities and increase resilience of food systems from field to household. Resilience can be described as the capacity of systems, communities, households, or individuals to prevent, migrate, or cope with the risk and recover from the shocks. So increasing resilience can be achieved by reducing exposure and reducing the sensitivity, and by increasing the adaptive capacity for every type of risk. So forests, so I'm going to be specifically talking about building resilience of forest systems. Forests contribute to the resilience of agricultural systems in many ways. At landscape level, they contribute to water and temperature regulation and provide habitats for important species, such as pollinators. At the household level, forests and trees play important roles in livelihood resilience in the face of climate change, including as they provide safety nets in times of emergency. They are sources of products important for production and income diversification from farm households to rural families, and as sources of employment, particularly important where farming and other rural livelihoods are no longer viable. So I'm going to highlight some actions that may be taken to maintain or increase resilience in forests through management and use of biodiversity at all scales. So there are 8 different risks or impacts I'll talk about, and what are the implications, what are the social, economic, or environmental implications of these risks, and how can this risk be reduced? What might be the response measures to be undertaken to reduce this risk? So the first one is decreased forest vitality and productivity. And this, because of this, it would lead to reduced revenue from wood and non-wood forest products and reduced forest ecosystem services. And the way to, some of the response measures could be to adjust silvicultural practices by changing the composition of species and varieties, increasing forest biodiversity, and implementing forest restoration measures. And then we will see an increased incidence of forest pests and diseases, which will reduce forest revenue, as well as reduce forest ecosystem services. And response measures would be to implement and intensify pest and disease management measures, as well as adjust silvicultural practices. And while increased wildfires, and in many places due to drought conditions, you can see the amount of wildfires that is happening now has really dramatically increased, which will lead to loss of life, damage of infrastructure, losses of wildlife, as well as reduced forest revenue and ecosystem services. And response measures would be to implement or intensify wildlife management and adjust silvicultural practices. And then increased water erosion and landslides will lead to damage to forests and infrastructures and reduce water quality. And response would include undertake watershed management measures, increase and protect vegetation cover, as well as reduce intensity of harvest and other uses of the forest. And then drought-induced forest or tree dieback and land degradation will reduce the availability of forest products, increased wind damage, and reduced values of grazing. So this can be mitigated by planting windbreaks, maintaining tree cover, as well as changing the composition of species and varieties. And another risk or impact is increased storm damage. And we have all seen where the severity of storms, especially cyclones and hurricanes, have become, the intensity has become much higher, leading to much higher damage. And this will reduce forest revenue and ecosystem services, as well as increase the risks of pests and diseases. And responses would include changing species and adjusting tree spacing to reduce risk, as well as pest and disease control. And another one would be the reduced extent and vitality of mangroves and coastal forests, which would lead to increased exposure of land to storm damage and reduced productivity of coastal fisheries. And the risk reduction can be done through increased protection, restoration, and enhancement of mangroves and other coastal forests. And then finally, the impacts of climate change and forests could lead to changes in species ranges and species extinctions. And we are at an unprecedented time in our human history where we have been seeing a lot of species becoming endangered or going extinct. And so this will reduce forest ecosystem functions, as well as loss of forest biodiversity. And the risk reduction could include restoring or increasing forest connectivity and wildlife corridors, and assisted migration, and as well as taking ex situ conservation actions. And so we really need to look at a new conservation paradigm. We have always looked at these different objectives like habitable climate, self-sustaining biodiversity, and good quality of life for all as separate entities, but we really need to look at them simultaneously because they are all interconnected. And the way we can achieve this is through nature-based solutions. And so we humans, we are utterly dependent upon the lives of others, the inherently generous and more than human species, other species with whom we share this planet. But we humans have neglected to take care of our earth. We live in an extraordinary extractive economy, and we have lost our connection to earth. And we deal with coping with the impacts of climate. As we deal with the impacts of coping with climate change, we must pay heed to indigenous wisdom, which in combination with science will be critical in restoring our planet. So I'm going to just talk about this book that I've recently read, the book called The Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a member of the Native American Potawatomi Nation. And she's a distinguished teaching professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. And she talks about reciprocity, giving back to the land from which we take without care for the implications, of what our actions might cost. And she talks about honorable harvest, which is the canon of indigenous principles that govern the exchange of life for life. They are rules. The honorable harvest is a set of rules that govern our taking, so that the world is as rich for the subsequent generations as it is for us. So the honorable harvest is a covenant of reciprocity between humans and the land, because indigenous culture gives so much priority to land and protecting the land and giving back to the land. So the honorable harvest, a practice both ancient and urgent, applies to the every exchange between people and the earth. Its protocol is not written down, but if it were, these are the different covenants, which says never take the first and never take the last. Harvest in a way that it minimizes harm to the earth, to the species or to earth, and take only what you need and leave some for others. Use everything that you take. Take only that which is given to you. Share it as the earth has shared with you, and be grateful, reciprocate the gift, and also sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. So I think we can learn a lot from our indigenous traditions and cultural practices. And so how we reciprocate the gifts of the earth. So this is, I'm going to read a little bit from her writing. It says, how can we reciprocate the gifts of the earth? In gratitude, in ceremony, through acts of practical reverence and land stewardship, in fierce defense of the places we love, in art, in science, in song, in gardens, in children, in stories of renewal, in creative resistance, in how we spend our money and our precious lives by refusing to be complicit with the forces of ecological destruction. Whatever our gift, we are called to give it and dance for the renewal of the world. So I think from these indigenous wisdom, I think the way we take care of our earth will be critical in how we mitigate climate change. So with that, thank you for having me on, and I will turn it back to, I think, was it Shakila?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sharatha. You have highlighted the importance of adaptation. Without adaptation, how food security will be affected across different countries and how Indian context it will be. Then the different kind of vulnerabilities of the food security, the economic, environmental and social. Also highlighted the new conservation paradigm, that is nature-based solutions. Morning also we had a discussion in the first session how nature-based solution and ecosystem services, ecosystem-based approaches can be promoted. And finally, you have quoted a book, how the book is reiterating the values in conservation. So now with that, we will move to the discussion part. 10 minutes more for the discussion. We will take up the questions now.
Thanks, Rangalakshmi. Hi, Sharada. Thanks for your talk and also all the other speakers in this session. And I think it's been raining outside, and after lunch I was walking here in the gardens. You really appreciate the the wealth of biodiversity that we have. But I have a comment for you, and perhaps you can go through our presentation later. But Mr. Ichel Guinea from South Africa spoke this morning about nature-based solutions, and what he said is that these are not very clearly defined. The way they're being defined in international negotiations is based entirely on European Union experiences. So, what is, and it should not be a way, it hasn't become, but he's saying we should be aware that it shouldn't transfer the burden of mitigation to land. Take away the focus on fossil fuels, which is obviously the Western countries which are using much more, and transfer the burden to land, and there's more land available in developing countries. So I just wondered if you'd like to comment on this, or maybe after you read his presentation you could comment on it.
Thanks, Madhura. Nature-based solution, it is not easy, and it is going to be changing in the context because it has different land and practices will have different system, and that is the biggest challenge with the term. We hear more and more the term regenerative agriculture, and there really isn't a definition for regenerative agriculture. There was actually a nice paper that came out from the University of Colorado on regenerative agriculture and what the term means, because there really isn't one set practice of regenerative agriculture. Everybody throws on their own definition of what it is. So we really need to come up with what is nature-based solution, but it has to be flexible to the land from which, because it has different countries or different regions will have different set. Talking about indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices, they're going to be different from one region to another. So yes, I think, yeah, we just cannot use, and especially not the Western way of thinking should not be enforced in other developing countries because they have different sets of challenges.
Any questions from online?
Good option to have the cattle, birds, fish, and if possible apiary in the system, along with the plants and trees, to have a more remunerative farming system. But of course, here we are discussing only the plant biodiversity. So otherwise, it becomes more complicated. Did you hear me? You have some. Am I clear? No, I'm just making a comment. Yeah. Because Dr. Mohan Kumar presented only the.
See, this is a kind of a response come question to any one of you can answer. See, one aspect which we have to keep in mind, when we say as a resilience response, when I listened to Dr. Sharada, you said, one of the options for increasing the resilience response is increasing the forest biodiversity. And when I listened to Dr. George Thomas and Dr. Mohan Kumar, they are talking about increasing the agrobiodiversity. And agrobiodiversity includes the kind of, your wild biodiversity also. So there is a trade-off issue. For example, if you take now in Kerala, there is an order, a legal order, you can shoot wild boars. Wild boars are attacking the farmers' crops. It's a menace now. So my question is, how do you address this trade-off issue where, particularly one side we want to increase the resilience of ecosystems, the other side, we want to have protecting the farmers from the same biodiversity. So this is it's a larger question. So what I would like to hear from you the kind of reflections. Thank you.
Okay, shall I answer that question?
Please, sir.
Okay, so the previous respected person also mentioned about biodiversity. See, when you talk about, Professor Mohan Kumar, he talked about home gardens. Probably he may not have highlighted the issue of rearing animals, apiary, then birds, poultry. Because in a typical homestead-based farming system, as we follow in Kerala, we include all these kind of things, along with the crops as well as animals, apiary, poultry, and whatever is possible, we accommodate all of them. So such a system is viable and also sustainable. So we follow, most of us follow such a kind of system. Well, with respect to the other one, the wild boars, they were declared as vermin, just like pests. So when we consider certain animals or certain organisms are pests. They have to be managed, they have to be controlled. So all of us know the meaning of carrying capacity. If the carrying capacity is high, and moreover, in forests, in the forest, they are not supposed to kill wild boars. Only the fringes of the forest, and also in farmers' field, you can do this. You cannot do this in the forest, in the true forest. Only in the fringes of forest and in farmers' field. And I heard that even in Australia, they go for culling kangaroos if the number is higher. So these are part of the balance in nature. So we may not, we need not be so much worried about such kind of solutions when there is an imbalance. Okay, I think it's enough. Clear.
I'm Dr. Hariharan speaking from MSSRF. This is again an open question, but right from the morning, from the HL's presentation to what we hear now, is we need to now strengthen the research priorities, especially in the areas. You know, so far we have conserved many of these indigenous varieties and so on. Now, we need to see how we can link it with economic, sustainability and, from the ecological perspective, it is fine. So this is the time we set the research priorities. You know, we are straight away working on the marginalized sections, small and marginal farmers. From the socio-economic perspective, we know where exactly the spectrum is lying on and the kind of diversity we are talking about. This is the rich diversity which is going to feed the world. So specifically with the Kerala context as well as the Indian context, we need to set the research priorities with respect to conservation and their sustainable use. We have the models, but still a lot of improvements are required. This is what I feel. And if you have some experiences from other parts of the globe, that will be wonderful, Dr. Sharatha. And to you also, Dr. Josh Thomas, if you have any specific examples of monetization of this diversity and how we can move again. Thank you.
I mean, that is going to be the challenge, is the monetizing, because a lot of these indigenous systems, I mean, there was a question in the chat as well about considering the socioeconomic relation for the indigenous farming communities, because the productivity growth is already low. And, you know, that is a challenge, because we have monoculture is where you get your high productivity and improved varieties. And when you go back to a farming system, which is indigenous, you know, that is going to be, but then, you know, it's a trade-off between taking care of the land as well as economic things. So yeah, we really need to identify, like with the nature-based solutions, we will have to see how it can also create economic growth for the farming communities. And that's where the research needs to happen.
Yeah, that's a real issue, because the agricultural system, whether he is a custodian farmer or not, it must be truly sustainable. That means in addition to social sustainability or ecosystem sustainability, it must be economically sustainable also. Otherwise, the so-called custodian farmers will not go or will not continue his fashion with so much of diversity. So that is happening in Kerala also. Sometimes his fashion may be to get some awards or some economic benefits from the government or some funding agencies. Once that is over, I don't know whether he will continue with that kind of occasions. So that also baffled me many times.
One of the key agenda of this particular international consultation is to set the priorities for the future as well. So it will be nice if you can share some of your, if the critical challenge areas where MSSRF can also focus, that will be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the challenge is going to be to, how can you, I think as Dr. George Thomas mentioned, how can you also be economically viable while using that? I mean, that becomes a priority for, I would say, the FEMSSRF to do the research on that. I know you're already like conserving at the Wayanad Center. I've seen the different diascorea and the different yams that are being conserved. And also within that, you have the farming system of the local indigenous farmers. And I think, that could become a priority of indigenous way of farming, of how that can be scientifically developed to become more sustainable.
Thank you. Sorry, one more small comment I wanted to leave here. See, for example, after the CBD, we have the provisions like recognition and reward for this, as well as provisions of access and benefit sharing. But they are yet to realize their full potential. That is where we are not able to really make the ends meet. This is one observation in many of the forests. Always it is felt. So we need to, focus more on that, with the chair of biodiversity here with us. So we look forward for some very, proactive solutions from your side.
Okay, this access and benefit sharing is a gray area. Probably after the 2021 amendments tabled by our parliament, we will be in a better position to go proceed with that. So now we are unable to proceed with access and benefit sharing and go ahead with levying some consideration from the industrialist. So that problem is there. Probably we will be able to do that, and we will be in a better position after the Parliament enact the amendments to 2002 Biodiversity Act. That's one area. And only if the industrialists or business people, they give their due share of using bioresources, then only we will be in a position to go ahead with this kind of research and funding traditional kind of agricultural systems. That is what we are facing.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. That is a very important area we can.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Sharada for providing a kind of key insights on how to carry forward the research agenda of MSSRF on those lines related to the theme. So with this, I thank all the 4 presenters for sharing your valuable experience, and the presentations were recorded, and we will be culling out the key lessons and come back to you with the final conclusions and carry forward points. So with this, we are closing this session. But before we closing, we have a 2 minutes film from CAbC. Let's see that film.
On behalf of Dr. Joseph and myself, Dr. Hussain, professionally thanks all the...
Sir, 1 minute, we'll see the film. After that we can. Sir, Dr. Hussain, sir. Yeah. You would like to...
We profusely thank all the speakers, particularly Professor Mohan Kumar, Dr. George Thomas, Dr. Sharada Krishnan, and Dr. Subramanyam for sharing their researchable and most valuable findings and enlightened us with actionable knowledge which can be taken into action for skill generations. We must thank chairperson for moderating the session excellently. Obviously, we thank all the dignitaries, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, online and offline, for interaction, better interactions, and patient hearing. And so, thanks so much, and thanks all of you. And now, at 4:45 p.m., now a tea break, and dinner will be served exactly at 8 p.m. in this campus. So, we request all of you to join. Thanks, all of you. And before that, after tea break, we'll go for around about the garden, and we visit all the areas of the gardens. So we request all of you to participate on that also. So thank you, all of you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so sorry to announce that the dinner will be served at 7:30 p.m. So all are requested to participate.